Participants from yesterday, welcome back. For those who are participating and joining us for the very first time, welcome to the Blue Carbon Knowledge Sharing Workshop, Day 2. This workshop is hosted by the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, the National Climate Change Office, Forest Department, Ministry of Blue Economy and Coastal Zone Management Authority and Industry, in collaboration with the World Wildlife Fund and Pew Charitable Trust, the Smithsonian Institute, and Silvestrum Climate Associates. Our workshop has 5 objectives, 4 of which we knocked out yesterday. We'll be looking at some of those again today, but we'll really be focusing on objective 5. The first objective is to share and engage on Belize's mangrove blue carbon assessment efforts and findings. The second, to discuss Belize's approach, capacity needs, and progress towards implementing protection and restoration targets for blue carbon habitats in Belize 2021 NDC update, including through associated projects, policies, plans, and frameworks. The third, to facilitate integration of mangrove blue carbon assessment findings within Belize's REDD+ inventory. The fourth, to offer briefings and discussions on priority areas of Phase 2 of Pew WWF partnership in Belize. And the fifth, to share information on mangrove land tenure analysis initiatives. If you looked at your agenda from yesterday, you noticed that we had a packed agenda. There was a lot of information sharing, and we opened the day with remarks from the Honorable Orlando Habet, the Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management. Minister Habet underscored the progress being made towards achieving Belize's NDCs, but also highlighted challenges and the need for collaboration from all sectors to move the work forward. Finally, he confirmed government's commitment to support the ongoing work and efforts with blue carbon. We then moved into a comprehensive overview of blue carbon and the role it plays in achieving Belize's NDCs. This presentation covered our commitments made in the Paris Agreement, outlined the NDCs that were passed by Cabinet in 2021 that cover a 10-year period. It looked at the costs associated with blue carbon, where shortfalls existed, highlighted ongoing collaboration, and once again reiterated the need for larger networking and community sensitization and collaboration. Presentations then moved to fostering protection of coastal ecosystems through the NDC and other engagement processes. We looked at an overview of Pew Coastal Wetlands Program and a recap of Phase 1 and Phase 2 of Pew WWF collaboration. And both presentations highlighted methodology and rationale for the work being done, but also how collaboration is able to yield measurable results. The 5 pillars of Phase 2 were outlined, which included the institutionalization of the Belize Mangrove Alliance and to create community-based mobilization networks for promoting mangrove protection and restoration. So again, we note the key role community engagement, networking, and allocation of resources is playing towards achieving Belize's NDCs. Then we started to move towards looking at research and findings. Dr. Morissette shared with us Belize's mangrove blue carbon assessment project overview and findings, and the total carbon stock that was calculated. We looked at measuring mangrove biomass and stocks for emission factor development and greenhouse gas accounting, the data gathered, the lessons learned, and the opportunities for the research to move into other steps, which includes carrying out full process method of gain losses for carbon accounting in greenhouse gas inventory. We looked at Belize's mangrove restoration efforts and the link that must be made between private and public sector for the restoration efforts to be successful. We then looked at key organizations and institutions poised to support the continued blue carbon work. Belize Coastal Zone Management Advisory Council, the Blue Bond and Finance Permanence Unit, the Belize Fund for Sustainable Future, and we learned about the development of the Belize Sustainable Ocean Plan. Finally, we rounded out the day looking at the CARICOM Blue Carbon approach, which created regional links for the work being done locally, the Global Mangrove Alliance and the Mangrove Breakthrough, a community of action dedicated to sustainably managing and increasing mangrove cover by 2030, and we moved from the international perspective to discuss local efforts through Belize's Mangrove Alliance, where we learned about the membership, its mandate, and key actions and opportunities for collaboration. So we really covered a lot of ground yesterday. And as Nadia highlighted, the presentations will be made available because there's a lot of key data and findings there that participants will find very useful as you continue this work. So in day 2, we're really looking to hone into, as I said before, that objective 5, to share information on mangrove land tenure and analysis initiatives, past and planned efforts. And this morning, to open up our discussion, our presentations, I want to invite Chantal Samuels forward, the Chief Executive Officer for the Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute, and she will be bringing to us Belize's Reef Resilience Strategy this morning. Ms. Samuels?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ishel, for that introduction. Evidently, much ground was covered yesterday, and I'm sorry to have missed all those presentations, but I look forward to accessing the presentations at the end of this workshop, Nadia. So we're foregoing the special remarks for today. My colleague, Ms. Kayleen Eck, is a little bit under the weather today, so I will be presenting Belize's engagement to deliver a strategy for reef resilience in Belize and to really underscore the importance of this unique partnership and how it is lending support to Belize to support further blue carbon development and specifically in the area of a coastal and marine land tenure assessment, which Nadia will go into greater details on. But I really want to reiterate, again, the importance of generating science, knowledge, and understanding of our blue carbon ecosystems because we know the important role they play in terms of climate regulation and mitigating global climate change. And similarly, as I mentioned, partnership is something that we should not think little of. Partnerships can take us a very long way. And in terms of blue carbon, we know that it can lend to necessary innovation so that it can spur science and information to impact the development of public policies so that we can continue to protect, restore, and engage in opportunities to explore the potential of blue carbon. So that said, so what is the Resilient Reefs Initiative? Essentially, it's a global partnership with reef managers and local communities to really respond to local and global threats. In terms of the Resilient Reefs Initiative, it was designed really as a call to action. So I think in 2019, there was a convening of reef managers from the various World Heritage sites to look at the fact that a lot of the response to global climate change has been on the side of adaptation and mitigation, but that there was really strength in the opportunity to further enhance resilience of our reef ecosystems. And so the Resilient Reefs Initiative emanated from that historic meeting. As I mentioned, it's a global initiative. The purpose is to support World Heritage coral reef managers and sites and the communities that depend on them to adapt to climate change and local threats. And there are really 4 pillars of this initiative. One is local leadership. The second is support for strategic planning. Thirdly, forming a knowledge network where global expertise can be harnessed as needed, and then support for action on the ground. And so in this slide, we just wanted to share an overview of the model of the Resilient Reefs Initiative and the delivery of that initiative. If you keep in mind those 4 pillars that I mentioned, In the first phase, we focused on local leadership, so bringing on new capacity in the form of a chief resilience officer, establishing the site to do the work. The second phase, which Belize is currently in and will soon be transitioning to the third phase, but the second phase focused on strategy development. Next month, we hope to launch the strategy for reef resilience in Belize, after which we will immediately move into action implementation. And underpinning all of this is the global expertise that we've been leveraging since the initiative has been established in Belize. So Belize finalized its partnership in 2020, and the initiative got on the ground in May of 2021 when we hired a chief resilience officer in the form of Ms. Kayleen Eck. And CZMAI is the delivery partner along with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation for the initiative in Belize. I also want to mention that in delivering this initiative, we work closely with the Fisheries Department and the Ministry of Blue Economy and Civil Aviation. And so Belize, as I mentioned, is one of the sites for the initiative, but there are these other 4 areas that are also piloting the initiative, this global initiative. And for the purpose of the initiative, the definition adapted for resilience is the capacity of reef ecosystems, the individuals, businesses, and communities that depend upon them to survive, adapt, and recover from the stresses and shocks that they experience. So by building resilience, we are strengthening the ability of reef communities to prepare for and recover from disturbances, adapt to changing circumstances, and critically important to plan for an uncertain future. I just wanted to share this framework that was developed by the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and used by the various sites participating in this initiative to assess reef resilience. So it's a holistic framework. It looks at 3 key dimensions: ecosystem, community, and governance. And all of these contribute to an integrated system to address resilience. The results, once you undergo a resilience assessment using this framework, the results really help to provide a good understanding of shocks and stressors to the reef ecosystem, the impacts on local communities. It helped us in Belize to get a sense of ongoing work, gaps, but also opportunities. We've done a lot of resilience-based reef management in Belize, and a lot of actions have been put forward, but some not implemented. So it allowed us, when we did this for our World Heritage Site, to really take stock of those opportunities and assess their feasibility going forward to help strengthen resilience. So the resilience assessment process, as I mentioned, provides for a holistic assessment of threats and opportunities across the ecosystem, across communities that are dependent on the reef, and governance based on a combination of research and stakeholder engagement. At CZMEI, we worked with local stakeholders to review strengths and weakness of the social and ecological dimensions of the system. We looked at critical resilience challenges that are currently affecting our reef ecosystem or are likely to affect the reef ecosystem and communities. In terms of how the assessment was conducted, we used existing science available. We looked at management plans. We examined policy documents, as well as integrated the experience and expertise of local reef managers and communities. And once we were able to assess and evaluate, we synthesized all the results to determine what the threats are and what the most feasible actions would be going forward. Once we iterated through the process and we had the opportunity to further refine the challenges and potential responses, we took this back to our stakeholders to undergo the validation process. And the results I will share with you shortly. And so this image we are currently sharing, and once you get the presentation, you'll have a chance to examine clearly. But again, it just underscores the interconnectedness between resilient communities and resilient ecosystems, and they cannot operate or exist in the absence of another. So, to the actions. Belize had the opportunity to identify the approach for its reef resilience strategy. So we could have taken the route of a traditional strategy where we would have identified a long list of actions that would require a high level of resources, and the likelihood of being implemented would be low. So we decided to take a flagship approach where we focused on 3 key actions. We took into consideration the resources that would be available for implementation, and we also took into consideration the potential for those actions to have important synergies with ongoing work or anticipated work in the future. So I'll quickly run through these because I know we're running down on time. One of the actions that will be in the soon-to-be endorsed resilience strategy will focus on strengthening coral reef resilience. And this action will be executed on the ground by key local partners, including the University of Belize Environmental Research Institute, the Belize Fisheries Department, and the Turneffe Atoll Sustainability Association, TASA. So one of the impetus for this is that we know that the stony coral tissue loss disease remains to be a very pressing issue. And response efforts to date have varied across reef ecosystems and within the marine protected area system. And there's still the need for additional information and research to inform the most appropriate and feasible management actions on the ground. And so through a proposal submitted to deliver on this action, local partners along with CZMAI will provide capacity to manage and interpret data sets from the various reef monitoring data available. This action seeks to explore strategic responses to dynamic threats, such as the stony coral tissue loss disease and other mass mortality events, and finally provide recommendations to scale and implement adaptive management. And the point of this slide is really to show that if you remember the resilience-based management framework, that there is alignment in terms of this action with the resilience-based management framework in the areas of community, governance, and ecosystem. The second action, which I won't delve into too much because Neda will be presenting shortly, but the second action in the strategy is to conduct a coastal and marine land tenure assessment. And we will be doing this through a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, the Lands Department, the Ministry of Blue Economy and Civil Aviation, and the Blue Bonds and Finance Permanent Unit. And then the last action will focus on resilient alternative livelihoods. This project, we anticipate, will provide a scalable, people-centered, and integrated approach towards developing adaptation strategies for addressing the economic impacts of climate change on vulnerable fishing communities. So through the delivery of this project, under the umbrella of the strategy, the project aims to strengthen the adaptive capacity of fisher folk and fishing communities by reducing their vulnerabilities to climate change through the adaptation of enhanced livelihood options, while simultaneously reducing pressure on degraded coastal and marine ecosystems. And so we will be delivering this again through a partnership with a local NGO, Wildlife Conservation Society, along with government partners under the Ministry of Blue Economy and Civil Aviation and the Belize Fisheries Department. And again, we just wanted to show that there is alignment of the actions and the outcomes with the resilience-based management framework. And so that brings me to the end of Kayleen's presentation on behalf of CZMAI. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, all of this work was done through a collaborative effort. We were able to leverage stakeholder engagement and buy-in really to get to this point and to ensure that our actions were grounded in resiliency. And we look forward to the implementation phase to continue to work with these partners to further achieve the objectives of the strategy, but to seek out opportunities to ensure alignment and synergies with relevant national policies, strategies, and plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Samuels, for that presentation. At this time, we do have a space in the agenda for any questions regarding this presentation on Belize's Reef Resilience Strategy. If we have no emerging questions, then we can move on to our second presentation for this morning, which is being brought to us by Ms. Nadia Budd, Senior Program Officer for World Wildlife Fund, Mesoamerica, and this will be on Belize's Reef Resilience Strategy, Coastal Marine Mangrove Land Tenure Analysis Overview. Nadia?
Thank you, Ishel, and good morning once again, everyone. Following up on Chantel's presentation, I'll be presenting on Action 2 that relates to the Coastal Marine Land Tenure Analysis. So this land tenure analysis will basically focus on mangroves. So we know that over the years we have seen an increased impact of mangroves on mangroves. We've seen loss of coverage of mangroves. We've seen defragmentation and loss of connectivity among mangroves at key locations, particularly along those development hotspots. And also knowing that around 70% of Belize's coastal area that includes mangroves are currently in private hands, it begs for us to understand what the current situation is in terms of the land ownership if we are to effectively engage with these stakeholders, these land stakeholders moving forward. And so the study itself is going to be focused, as I mentioned, on mangrove ecosystems because we want to understand who owns the existing mangrove properties. We'll be looking at the areas within the mainland coast, thinking of an area interest of at least 10 kilometers from the mean high water mark inland, looking at the areas within the coastal planning regions, and this includes the outer keys and the atolls as well. But the idea behind this thinking is so that we can have information, that we can have meaningful engagement with both public and private land stakeholders moving forward, so that we can try to share ideas and options for conservation, for restoration, for green options for developing their property where safeguarding or protection of the ecosystems can be utilized pretty much, no? So they in turn will then be reducing their environmental footprint on their property. As Chantel mentioned, this is Action 2 within the resilience strategy. And so I'm just showing this slide here. I don't have to go into details because Chantel already mentioned some of these things. But it is a partnership led by the Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute, and we've been tasked to help lead the land tenure analysis in partnership with the Lands Department. We have Keisha Rodriguez that is going to be the point person, the Deputy Commissioner, Land Commissioner, that will be the point person from the Lands Department side. It also includes a partnership with the Forest Department, with the Blue Economy Ministry, the Blue Bond, and us, and then with supporting, some of the supporting financing from this is also coming from PU. In terms of the project aims, we want to update the mangrove land tenure analysis. In 2017, we did do, through the collaboration with the Belize Association of Planners, coastal marine land tenure analysis, also focusing on the World Heritage Site, and we'll get a presentation from that on that later on this morning. But it's from 2017, and Ms. Sandiford is going to talk about some of the key issues that they faced when they tried to do that coastal marine land tenure analysis at that time. So we know that there are gaps, and that we need to fill these gaps if we are to make strides in conserving these ecosystems. The approach will be a multidisciplinary one. We want to be able to use the empirical information generated, not only to understand ownership, but also to be able to understand the footprint and the threats that are being faced by these ecosystems that are also in private hands, of course. No? We will be using the information also to engage stakeholders, both public and private, on better policies, plans, practices, and actions for a sustainable approach to resource management, thinking of nature-based solutions along the way. And also we'll be building capacity. So the idea is to also build capacity within the government departments to be able to replicate this kind of study going forward. So it'd be looking at the Lands Department, looking at the Coastal Zone, looking at Fisheries Department, for example, so that this kind of information this kind of assessment can be repeated, so that Belize can have a good understanding of what the tenureship of mangrove properties are as we proceed into the future. So an area of interest, as I mentioned before, 10 kilometers from the high water mark, considering also the coastal planning regions, to understand ownership and to identify viable areas for mangrove restoration, sustainable management, protection, and also to include in the blue carbon framework, that is framework, as well as the national carbon strategy that the country is interested in pursuing. Objective 2, use findings to inform Belize's coastal marine land inventory and the development of a national blue carbon framework and mangrove restoration plan that we mentioned yesterday, as well as to provide ideas for conservation of these ecosystems that can be integrated into the Belize project finance for permanence that is also under development at this point in time in terms of the conservation plan. And objective 3, use findings to inform engagement with private coastal landowners and actions to conserve mangroves where possible. So there are a number of outputs that we expect to have through this assessment. One being an updated land inventory registry that showcases the true tenureship of mangrove property and accompanied database within the Lands Department. There will be a land tenure GIS layer with property boundaries that the government can use to inform their management efforts going forward. There's going to be a land tenure map differentiated by ownership type with property boundaries as well. There will be a technical report that describes process findings and recommendations from the tenure analysis, because we also want to share this information not only nationally but more broadly as well. There will be a land tenure case study for the government entities that they can use in their engagements around land resource management, particularly along the coast. There will be a land tenure case study for international audience to inform the Reef Resilience Global Network, because as Chantel mentioned, this has been funded by through a global initiative. There will be a suite of key agreed upon actions for mangrove management, protection, and restoration. We also want to produce tailor-made information package for private landowners engagement, including an engagement strategy of how we can do that. There'll be a database of private landowners of mangrove lands for the government. This will be for the government's eyes only. And then there will be a land stakeholder engagement strategy and action points for engagement going forward. So the land tenure analysis will offer an opportunity for informing stakeholders about the opportunities for protecting their land, because if we are to make advance in our engagement with the private landowners, we need to know who owns what and how, and how can we engage them. So if we have this kind of information, we can develop a strategy on how best to do that and implement that strategy going forward. Particularly, we want to be able to contribute to the development of a national blue carbon framework. We want to support and incentivize ecosystem restoration in coastal and marine ecosystems. We want to support green development options within mangrove landscape, for example. We need to know who to engage. We want to inform other related national policies. And finally, we want to inform stakeholders, landowners, local communities on the core benefits of carbon sequestration and blue carbon projects. So the land tenure analysis, if we have the information of who owns what and where, we will better be able to devise a strategy going forward on how we can effectively engage these private and public land stakeholders. Yeah, I think that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Nidia, for the presentation, the overview, looking at objectives and key strategies that are being implemented. This time, I want to invite Ms. Keisha Rodriguez, Deputy Land Commissioner, Department of Lands and Survey, Ministry of Natural Resources, and she will be bringing to us land and tenureship in resource management.
Good morning, everybody. The Lands and Surveys Department, we're really happy to be partnering with the WWF, the Coastal Zone Management Authority, to work on this land tenure analysis project. In 2017, as Nadia mentioned, we had done, well, one was done. At the time, I was with the Belize Association of Planners, as one of the consultants on that work. So this is going to add on what we had done at that time. So today I will be doing a short presentation, trying to talk a little bit about land administration and management in Belize and what implications there are for resource conservation and management, particularly with coastal land resources. So the content of my presentation, I'll speak a little bit about land as a natural resources, what we mean by land tenure and land administration, what departments, how we manage land in Belize, land resources, and especially through the Ministry of Natural Resources. And then, of course, what are some implications for land administration and management as we try to be more sustainable and try to be resilient to climate change? What are the implications for us? As we know, land is a very valuable natural resource, perhaps the most valuable. It is a finite resource, so there's only a certain amount of territory that we have as a nation, and so we need to know how we need to sustainably manage what we have. There are always many competing uses for land. We need physical space for settlements, we need space for industry and commerce, we need space for or land for agriculture, production of food, for the extraction of minerals and raw materials for our uses. And also we need to conserve land for ecosystem services. So all of these uses are competing, and primarily in this coastal areas, in this coastal space, there is high demand for land resources and high competing uses. You have people, of course we know, and throughout this workshop we have been speaking about the carbon stocks within our coastal ecosystems, and so that urges us to want to conserve, but then at the same time, our country is very dependent on tourism as an economic driver. So we also want to develop those lands for tourism and for the enjoyment, for our people's enjoyment, etc. So those are all competing uses that we need to manage responsibly. Land tenure systems determine who can use what resources, for how long they can use it, and under what various conditions they can use it. From the English system, and there's also customary systems. And of course, in Belize, we recently, with the indigenous communal land rights, we are now navigating how that customary system and the statutory system are going to exist in parallel. Land administration is the way in which the rules of land tenure are applied and made operational. So there's a range of systems and processes in place to administer land rights. What are the boundaries to rights, to land? Who have the ability to transfer? How do you inherit land and so forth? How we use land, what are the highest and best use for certain land, etc. As well as land valuation and taxation. You pay, when you get a lease, you have rents that you pay, as well as you pay land taxes. So the valuations department for land. And also land information. We need to know who owns land, like in the case of needing to do the land tenure analysis, who owns it, what are their rights, what certain restrictions are there, and of course this needs to be displayed and mapped. Oh, sorry. So in terms of land administration, we have, and management, we have two departments. We have the Land Registry Department, which is headed by, under the Ministry of Natural Resources, we have the Land Registry Department, which is headed by the Registrar of Lands. And the Land Registry records the ownership rights of freehold properties and leasehold properties, where lease has been granted for a term exceeding 7 years within compulsory registration areas in the country, or declared, what we call declared areas. It guarantees title to registered estate and interest in land under the Registered Land Act. There's also the Land Titles Unit, which is responsible for registration and dealing of all lands that is not within the compulsory registration areas. So we call it in the undeclared areas under the General Registry Act. And they also deal with the Strata Title Registration Act, which allows for the registration of units resulting from horizontal or vertical subdivision, divisions or subdivisions of buildings on a common property. So that's like condos and so forth, to be registered with a freehold title. And the map that you're seeing, the brown areas are showing the declared registered areas, and the white areas are the undeclared areas. So you can see that most of the northern part of the country is declared, and so that falls under the Registered Lands Act, and as well all of the towns, San Pedro, all of Ambergris Caye, and most of and areas like Placencia. The other department is the Lands and Surveys Department, and that is headed by the Commissioner of Lands. And the department is divided into 5 sections. We have the National Estate section, which deals with the management and allocation of national lands. And what is national lands? Well, national land is all land and seabed other than protected areas and areas already granted. The surveys and mapping sections deal with delineating boundaries of land, ensuring that plans and legal surveys are authenticated. The physical planning section has responsibility for land use planning. The principal act that governs the physical planning section is the Land Utilization Act. But in terms of land use planning, that act is very narrow. So it deals primarily with the subdivision of private land. The physical planning section also regulates the use of the 66-foot reserve and the use of the seabed. So they are able to license piers and other structures that are within the 66-foot seawall. 66-foot reserve. The valuation section, like I mentioned before, they're responsible for valuing land valuation and taxation. They have different categories of land. If, for example, you're buying or purchasing national land, they set the purchase price for national land. They have different categories of land. One of those categories being beach lands. So those are lands within coastal areas. They set the price, the purchase price that you would pay for national land in those areas, as well as the rent or taxes that landowners would pay. Regarding lands. And they have other larger functions as well in terms of spatial data for the country. But they support the department with spatial data, spatial analysis, etc. Sustainability and resilience and implications for land administration and management. If we, as a country, we're ensuring that we're managing land sustainably, we're also looking at being resilient to climate change and ensuring disaster risk reduction. It requires a transformation in how we manage land. And so this requires us to look at our policy, our legislative, and our institutional framework. Primarily, I want to talk a little bit about land use and spatial planning, the fact that this is a major gap in how we are managing lands currently. Since 2010, 2011, we had a national integrated planning, a national land use policy and integrated planning framework, but it was approved but never implemented. In 2019, the national land use policy and framework was revised. Again, it was not implemented. So, so we're at 2023, and we're still in need of revising that national land use policy and coming up with a national integrated planning framework that really works for us, for our country. A lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of how we are to sustainably manage coastal lands, but not only coastal lands, but lands throughout the country, land use planning and proper land use planning and regulating and statutory plans are, in fact, will solve a lot of those issues. We don't have any structures really in place for proper land use planning, for development permitting, etc. So that is a major gap, and I think one that we need the support of the conservation community to really advocate for, that we can get this in place. As well, I just highlight all of our acts and policies need to, of course, be looked at and revised and ensure that they're in alignment with our conservation goals, our nationally determined contributions, and our other plans and national plans and policies. But in particular, I wanted to highlight that the land tax system, of course, needs to be looked at. A lot of our beach lands, for example, I think are paying very minimal land tax in certain areas. Those are outside of our towns and cities, etc. So, and as well looking at it, at how the system would be able to capture or provide incentives for carbon credits and the carbon markets. I think that's an area that we really would have to look at in revising our land tax system. Definitely improved land information system is sorely needed, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're so excited about this project, because it would provide us with an opportunity to update a portion, at least a portion of our land information with regards to coastal land. So there is need, a lot of our information regarding land is still in old deed books, and we need to digitize those information. A lot of the survey plans need to be digitized, and we do land inventory. I had mentioned previously about the land registration system. A lot of people, a lot of public are still not aware that they fall within registration system, the registration or declared area, and they are still holding on to old land documents that they need to apply for first registration. So because of that, they're not updated in the system. So public education to ensure that people are able to, especially in the areas that are declared, to apply for first registration, to update our system, and so forth. Data accessibility and dissemination. With updated systems, we can find ways to have more open access to information, and that leads to better accountability and transparency. We have technologies that you can share certain information via the internet or via the web, etc. I always recall in 2017, I went on a program in the US to Virginia, and the first day I was working with the Piedmont Environmental Council, and the first day my mentor took me to the lands department for the Albemarle County, and he just walked into the department. What they did was to register conservation easements for areas in the county. So he informed me that a piece of property had recently sold. So he just wanted to verify that the conservation easement was registered with the property to the new owner. So he walked up to the computer, and he checked, and he could verify that the conservation easement was there with the property. And I think those are the type of things that we want to move towards, that there's more openness and transparency and accountability. Integrating new technologies in, for example, how we do surveys. Our system needs a lot of, there are lots of new technologies, the use of drones that we can integrate into our work processes to make our system more precise, more accurate, and of course, more efficient. Capacity building is definitely an area that we need a lot of work on. We have professions within land management, such as planning, urban and regional planning, community planning, physical planning, where there's very few professionals in Belize with those kinds of qualifications. Surveying, again, another one where our professionals in surveying are older, and we don't have a lot of young people who are going into those professions. Land valuation. So the department and also the country on a whole, we need to look at building capacity within those professions, but not only building the professional capacity, but also ensuring that those professionals in those areas are able to know about climate resilience, disaster risk reduction, and are informed in areas of sustainable development, etc. And as well, lastly, as I mentioned previously, public engagement and public and community engagement. There's always a lot of, I think, mystery surrounding land and the process of land allocation, distribution, and so forth. So I think we need to better engage the public so that they're able to know what their rights and their responsibilities are as landowners, as leaseholders, and of course also as the objective of this land tenure analysis is to ensure that they can find ways to engage with them to conserve the mangrove that falls on their property. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rodriguez. A wealth of information, looking at where we are, where we need to go, and what are some of the challenges that still face when we're talking about land tenureship and resource management. We are coming up to our break in the program, but we do have a few moments if anybody has any questions, anything that has emerged. I have two, one in the front and then one in the back. If we could get the roving microphone, please.
Thanks, Michelle, and great presentation, Keisha. And I know we had a conversation yesterday, and Nadia shared some information regarding the fact that, or stating the fact that 80% almost of coastal lands are privately owned, and there have been reports done on the fact that there is a land grab in Latin America, probably the Caribbean as well. My question is, how do we create an environment where conservation projects that depend on providing incentives, meaning that it's not too expensive to invest in conservation, especially for blue carbon projects, can be facilitated because the alternate scenario is if we have free access to this information, then it becomes easier for people who are speculating in coastal lands to grab lands and then just sit on it until they get a good price, and that kind of outcompetes what conservation resources might be there to invest in coastal conservation. Sorry for the long-winded question, but there's a lot of context to it. Directed it to Keisha, sorry.
Yes, that's a quite complex question, Roberto. I think that there is really no answer, one answer. that is indeed what has been happening, of course, that people know the value of coastal properties, and so they're trying to acquire to whether it be for development in the tourism sector. They're trying to anticipate where would be the next, I guess, hotspot and so forth. I think some of the points that I brought up in terms of being more open in this information, being more open, and knowing who owns what, and having access to that information would be one way, as well as more in public engagement, communities being more aware of or being more involved, especially if we have planning processes occurring where communities are determining how we want to use our coastal land resources, and ensuring that those plans are developed with the communities, they are implemented, and they're also statutory. And so even if you have a piece of land and it's designated as an area that, you know, yeah, so I think definitely planning would be, and planning with communities would be one of those major ways in which we can ensure that those lands are developed more sustainably. And I just think working along with the community is the primary way.
Thank you. I have one question here. I have a question on Zoom, Dr. McKay, and then my question to the back. Right over here.
Thank you, Ms. Kisha, for the presentation. Minerva Gonzalez from the Landscape Restoration Desk at the Forest Department. So I have a quick comment and a question. I saw that there was a little bit of discussion on your side whether or improvement of the land tax system. And I agree that that is very necessary and it's becoming very urgent. We are rapidly moving into a more conservative approach, and we've seen that there are many private landowners that have forested areas that are reluctant to keep them forested because the land taxes are much higher than lands that are deemed developed, that are cleared. So there is a necessity to improve that land tax system, since we are now thinking about carbon credits, and we do not want the situation to become that everyone is clearing their land, but then when it comes to implementing a carbon credit system, then they will have to replant, and it's going to have more negative effects than keeping the actual forested lands. My question, though, is a bit different from that topic. I work with restoration at the Forest Department, and we have had a lot of interest from private landholders in the coastal communities that want to do restoration, and they have been trying to get proper permits, they say. At the Forest Department, we can support them in implementing different restoration techniques. However, they are not able to start that restoration because apparently you need some kind of beautification permit from the lands department. I have no idea what that is, so I wanted to know from your end whether that is an actual thing.
I don't know about a beautification permit. Um, all I know is if it's within the 66 feet reserve, then they would need to apply for permission to do work on that. Or
What
use
kind
it.
of permit would that be?
Sorry?
What kind of permit would that be?
The permit to utilize the 66-foot reserve. That's from a physical planning.
Okay, okay. Maybe I need to talk to you later. But
But I don't know about that beautification.
yeah, they've been calling the lands department because they do not want to get into that 66-foot buffer or reserve without the proper permission and then possibly being, I don't know, charged or something by the lands department. But we have been trying to get I forgot her name at land utilization, land planning, the planning section. Yeah, but I haven't heard back as yet.
Maybe you can forward what exactly they have been saying to us, and then we could look at it, and as well with our legal department, or legal unit. I don't recall anything about a beautification
Yeah,
permit,
they even
though.
give it a name, a beautification permit. I don't know what that is.
I think there's a lot of areas that needs clarification, that needs us looking at comprehensively, because for many years we have just been doing things, and some of it maybe we have not really researched the legal basis of it. So I think definitely we could look at it and see what the basis is for that.
Thank you very much, ladies. Clarification on that point. Dr. McKay, if you'd like to go ahead, and then we'll do our Zoom questions, and then we have one observation in the back.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Elma K.
Okay, sorry.
from Belize Maya Forest Trust. And Ms. Keisha, thank you very much for that presentation. I think this was one that we were all waiting for. The issue of land is so complex, and I think you rightly point out that, you know, this land use policy that we have been forever working on, you know, various iterations, it feels like that needs some sort of civil society movement to finally, like, get it going. I understand from the conversation at our lunch table yesterday that the government may once more have funds to initiate this process. So I think we would very much like to hear on how we can partner with the, with the government technical people to, you know, like I say, support that this one really goes through. So that's something that we can definitely talk about. But a big concern that I have is the pattern that we are seeing in this country, where I actually feel that within 20 years, Belizeans will become the landless. It really feels like the entire country is up for sale. Real estate is a really lucrative business. And that we desperately need some type of land reform to ensure that, you know, Belizeans do not become the landless 20 years from now. Because it is so easy, you know, once you get sick, once there's a death in the family, once you're hit with any tragedy, the one thing you can sell is your land. And foreign interest will always have more money to pay for that land than Belizeans have. So they're, you know, and then we won't be able to buy it back. So how can we partner with your department at this point, or how can you be an ally to, for example, generating information on how much of land is, for example, currently foreign owned, and what might be steps, specific steps that we could take to advocate for specific land reforms that, you know, prevent Belizeans from becoming landless in 20 years. And I know this is like very long-winded, but the other issue that this creates as Belizeans become landless and sell their plots that they have, then the encroachment in protected areas continues. And so there's this feeling that there's more land to be grabbed somewhere else, so I can sell my land, but there's also other land to be squatted in. And so I, again, just want to understand, within your department, who are the people that we can talk to see how, what information is needed to start, and what funding is needed to start creating these building blocks of information that allow us to take concrete action or put recommendations in place. I think from civil society, we can definitely advocate for some of these things if perhaps we can, prioritize some of the actions, and especially as you look at putting a new land policy in place. So I know that's very broad, but, it almost feels like we're not quite sure where to go or who to really talk to.
Okay, thanks, Dr. K. Yes, that is a very, very challenging question. But I will start by saying, in terms of who we can talk to, I think definitely we have a minister who is open to speaking with anybody, and I'm sure with the NGO community. And we have, one of the first places I think we can start is definitely with the land use policy process. I think that will open up the conversation for many of these things to be discussed. And for us to set where we want to address some of those issues that you're saying. And also, because I mentioned that the physical planning section, particularly the Land Utilization Act, is so narrow, it deals with primarily just private land subdivision. We're doing these land subdivision on a one-off basis, so project by project. Many of them are geared towards the real estate market, and so the community involvement is not necessarily there through that process. If we look at planning in a more holistic way, looking at what the impact would be on communities, looking at cultural, traditional uses of land and so forth, then I think we can have more of an impact on how, what type of development we want to see in the country. Another issue is also, as we speak about climate resilience and making resilience is one of our priorities, we also have to look at how we're planning settlements. We have been traditionally planning our settlements in a sprawl type of development, looking at large lots, large single-family lots. And I think every Belizean have that, we have that desire to want our own single lot with the single-family home. But is that really climate resilient? It's also a very transport-dependent mode of development. So those are some of the things that we would have to look at in terms of when we're thinking about climate resilient development and how we plan our settlements for the future, because those kinds of development, they really utilize a lot of land, and also they're very expensive in terms of infrastructure, putting in the infrastructure, etc. So it really requires us as a country, and I don't mean just the political directorate, but us, the society, to determine what we want. Because if that is the type of development that we're saying that we want, then that's how we're going. So I think the planning process would allow us, looking at the policy and looking at the framework for how we approach planning will be able to address a lot of those issues. So I think we could start there.
Thank you very much. We have questions that have been submitted to us via Zoom. And so at this time, we're going to get into those. These have been submitted from Mr. David Hilmy. The first one is, I have a couple of questions for Nadia's presentation. One, given that mangroves grow in intertidal zone, what is the role of crown land as concerns property ownership? Example, most mangroves, mainland coasts, estuaries/rivers will grow on crown land. Two, on man-made waters such as canals, there is also a reserve of up to 12 feet under the Land Utilization Authority, which is not private land. So therefore, is this space where mangroves can be planted, either public or under direct permit from the Lands Department? Those are the first two.
Yeah, I think in terms of the second one, that question posed by Minerva to Keisha, sort of touch on that in terms of what can be done within the 66 feet reserve, no, immediately along the shoreline. In terms of the first question that relates to ownership, the thing is, as we mentioned before, the land tenure analysis will not only look at private lands, but also public lands. So we want to know who owns what and where. And so with that information, that will inform the strategy going forward in terms of how to promote conservation, sustainable management, and restoration activities. Let me just repeat the question again. Given the first one was given that mangroves grow in the intertidal zone, what is the role of crown land as it concerns the property ownership? I think again the 66 feet reserve should be maintained. Keisha, could you?
The 66 feet reserve is national land.
Okay, but I guess some cases we are seeing, the concern might come from the fact that some cases we are seeing that a person purchase a piece of land and clear it to the water line too, no? How do we deal with such issues going forward, knowing that they are intruding on areas that should be crown land, no?
I think there's some clarification that needs to be made in terms of the what exactly the 66 feet reserve should be, because there have been, I know, issues where people have mentioned there's erosion, their property, where the 66 feet was no longer in place, it has eroded, and so I think there is some legal clarification that needs to happen there, because I've heard conflicting information about about the 60 reserve and where it should be with regards to property. I've heard they mention that it should be an easement in the property as well, but I think we need some legal clarification.
Yeah. So I guess with this project that would offer an opportunity to get at some of those things, because the project would also bring some of the key players to the table to discuss how to move forward in terms of this thing. Also probably looking at historical data, because some people might say their property eroded, but if you look back, you know, where was that boundary line before, so.
And that's where accuracy in the surveys and so would help, and new technologies in surveying and so would help with those kinds of issues.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. I think that addresses the questions that were posed via Zoom. I have one other question in the back to round off this session before we go into our break this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Eli Romero, Project Development Unit at PAC. It's more of a comment relating to land tenure. I know that under the agreements for leased land, it sort of spells out that you need to have some sort of development for maintaining leased land, which if you look at what are we proposing, especially with blue carbon, you need to develop a framework to be able to incentivize the opposite, which is basically not developing the land and then maintain your tenureship for the land. So I think that is very important to be included in the revision of the policy or framework for land tenure. And then one last one, I think you touch a little bit on it, Nadia, is on relating to the 66 feet of a buffer zone. I think we have been hearing this for many years. We have this in paper. It's almost never enforced. And I don't think always finding excuses is any way of addressing the issue. There needs to be very concrete set of actions, increased penalties, and enforcement of the legislation to actually get it done, because I feel like it's similar to what happens in our neighboring countries, Mexico, for example. They tell you that it's cheaper to pay the fee than to go through the process of protecting the buffer zone and getting the necessary permits. So until we are able to address those, because it's not that we don't know the benefit of the coastal vegetation, mangroves specifically, seagrass, but we don't do anything. Afterwards, we kind of cut down everything, and then we want money for addressing beach erosion. So we shoot ourselves in the foot, and then we start to complain about it. So I think we really need to take concrete actions. As somebody mentioned earlier, it needs to be driven not only by one sector, but everybody included, because at the end of the day, the impacts of climate change on coastal communities affects everybody. Even the ones in the mainland have some indirect impacts on it. So I think we really need to take action and start just talking about this is what we have in paper and this is what should be done.
Thank you very much. Very important observations. I think just before we close off this section, we do have a follow-up question from Mr. David Hilmy. It is, assuming all mangrove space is within the 66 reserve or LUA, as per Ms. Keisha's prior answer to Minerva, is it correct that permission need only be obtained from lands, not private owners? Therefore, organizations such as Belize Mangrove Alliance can get this permission for our 4,000 hectares restoration NDC.
I think within those areas, yes, but I think the project is also looking at beyond and into the properties of landowners.
One of the things that David was trying to get at is that in the national determined contribution, there's a target set for 4,000 hectares by 2030, and knowing that there might be some permission that needs to be, we don't know exactly where the interventions are going to happen, but in case they exist in the 66 feet reserve, knowing this is a target for the government as well, how do we address that, no? And this is something that I guess we'll have to come to the table to discuss going forward, no? But getting clarity on what can be done within that area, the 66 feet reserve, would help a lot in terms of advancing some of those targets, no? Particularly on the public side of things.
Thank you very much. This has been a very dynamic session. Questions, we've been rolling along, finding answers, and also uncovering areas that need further exploration and discussion and collaboration. So we've reached the point of our program this morning where we will take our morning break for 10 minutes. I want to invite you to stretch your legs, enjoy the refreshments. Also share and discuss the information that has been shared here this morning, because to round out this morning, we are going to have a question and answer section following our last presentation for this morning, which is a recap of past coastal marine land use and tenureship findings for Belize. And so we are looking forward to your participation in that discussion section. And just to remind you that at 12, the workshop will officially end, and there is a working session this afternoon for a closed group. So at this time, I want to invite you to take your break, and we look forward to seeing you in 10 minutes.
to determine the amount of organic carbon found in soils and plants. As seagrass is also recognized for their high carbon sequestration ability, this mangrove carbon assessment will also be complemented with a similar assessment for seagrasses.
We've gone into the field and got data from the country understanding that each mangrove system, seagrass system, is really different up and down the country. So we started up in New River, right to the north, worked our way down to Punta Gorda, and did some sampling as well along the Keys. By doing these individual estimates of these different sites, we get a much better understanding of what these systems are storing in terms of carbon. From that, rather than using regional estimates or global estimates, we're able to give a much better accounting of the blue carbon in these systems for Belize.
The resulting data will provide a more precise and quantitative valuation of the carbon storage benefits of mangroves and, to a lesser extent, seagrass, to aid in the implementation of Belize's NDC. In Belize, mangroves and seagrass are critical habitats and key to the local economy. It is estimated that mangroves alone contribute over $14 million in fisheries value, $176 million in tourism recreation, and $167 million in coastal protection per year. Mangroves and seagrasses are natural carbon sinks, meaning they take in carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that is rapidly increasing due to human activities, and lock this carbon away, incorporating it in their tissues, roots, and soil.
Coastal ecosystems take carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and CO2, and then they convert it into plant material, some of which gets stored into the ground. And one of the reasons why coastal ecosystems are so important is that the carbon that stays in the ground can last for centuries.
That's why it is key for Belize to continue protecting mangroves. Do you agree? According to the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, each signatory country is expected to submit an updated National Climate Action Plan known as Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. Within their NDCs, countries communicate the actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries can consider protecting and restoring mangrove and seagrass ecosystems in their NDCs as a nature-based solutions to climate change. Belize has committed to protecting and restoring its mangrove and seagrass ecosystems within its NDC because of their benefits for carbon storage and coastal protection. A new research project in Belize seeks to contribute to this. Researchers have conducted fieldwork, including soil sample collection and measurements of mangrove trees to determine the amount of organic carbon found in soils and plants. The resulting data will provide a more precise and quantitative valuation of the carbon storage benefits of mangroves and, to a lesser extent, seagrass, to aid in the implementation of Belize's NDC.
Belize is home to spectacular biodiversity on land and at sea. Our barrier reef is home to almost 1,400 species, some endangered. The reef works together with mangrove forests and seagrass beds to provide benefits for nature and people. However, these benefits are coming under threat. The combined effects of climate change and human activity are impacting these habitats, causing accelerated degradation of critical coastal ecosystems, and is jeopardizing their biodiversity. The degradation of these habitats not only endangers the species who call it home, but threatens the security of hundreds of thousands of Belizeans. Before we lose these habitats for good, we need to learn more about their importance to our own lives.
Mangroves and seagrasses, two of Belize's natural ecosystems, can be found in many places along Belize's coast. Globally, coastal zones with these ecosystems are considered some of the most productive places. They are important habitats, feeding grounds, and nurseries for numerous species. Turtles, manatees, birds, crabs and various species of fish, from sharks to groupers, use these areas to feed, shelter, and reproduce. These ecosystems also provide nations with physical protection from storms and floods. In Belize, mangroves and seagrass are critical habitats and key to the local economy. It is estimated that mangroves alone contribute over $14 million in fisheries value, $176 million in tourism recreation, and $167 million in coastal protection per year. The benefit of these ecosystems extends well beyond their value for biodiversity. Coastal ecosystems can help communities mitigate against and adapt to climate change. Mangroves and seagrasses are natural carbon sinks, meaning they take in carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that is rapidly increasing due to human activities, and lock this carbon away, incorporating it in their tissues, roots, and soil.
Mangroves such as these take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We extract it, it goes into biomass, and then some of it goes into soils where it can be stored for thousands of years.
By removing carbon from the atmosphere and providing climate adaptation benefits, these ecosystems can play a role in global efforts to lessen the impacts of climate change.
They buffer shorelines, they help stabilize sediments, and so as a result, they are nature-based solutions to climate change, and countries can include them in climate response policies such as the Paris Agreement.
To meet this task, it is first helpful to understand the associated carbon stored within the ecosystem.
Pew Charitable Trust and WWF, they had spearheaded the efforts of upgrading our targets and actions with regards to blue carbon. And they had proposed carrying out assessments on our coast to upgrade the actions and the targets in the NDC, and also to value blue carbon systems.
A new research project seeks to help answer this question. This first-of-its-kind project in Belize is being led by the Smithsonian Institution, World Wildlife Fund, and the Pew Charitable Trust with expertise from Silverstrom Climate Associates, the University of Belize, and in collaboration with local NGO partners and national government.
Testing. Good morning, everyone. This is your 2-minute warning. We're going to start back in approximately 2 minutes. Thank you.
Will provide a comprehensive assessment of carbon stored within mangrove forests across Belize and develop a baseline carbon stock estimate for seagrass.
This field work that we just did is just helping to provide us with some additional justification for why we need to protect these ecosystems. As the aim now is for us to understand the quantity of carbon that these ecosystems are sequestering nationally, and so that this information can then be integrated within Belize's REDD+ inventory.
Researchers have conducted fieldwork, including soil sample collection and measurements of mangrove trees to determine the amount of organic carbon found in soils and plants. As seagrass is also recognized for their high carbon sequestration ability, this mangrove carbon assessment will also be complemented with a similar assessment for seagrasses.
We've gone into the field and got data from the country, understanding that each mangrove system, seagrass system, is really different up and down the country. So we started up in New River, right to the north, worked our way down to Punta Gorda, and did some sampling as well along the Keys. By doing these individual estimates of these different sites, we get a much better understanding of what these systems are storing in terms of carbon. From that, rather than using regional estimates or global estimates, we're able to give a much better accounting of the blue carbon in these systems for Belize.
The resulting data will provide a more precise and quantitative valuation of the carbon storage benefits of mangroves and, to a lesser extent, seagrass, to aid in the implementation of Belize's NDC. In Belize, mangroves and seagrass are critical habitats and key to the local economy. It is estimated that mangroves alone contribute over $14 million in fisheries value, $176 million in tourism recreation, and $167 million in coastal protection per year. Mangroves and seagrasses are natural carbon sinks, meaning they take in carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that is rapidly increasing due to human activities, and lock this carbon away, incorporating it in their tissues, roots, and soil.
Coastal ecosystems take carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and CO2, and then they convert it into plant material, some of which gets stored into the ground. And one of the reasons why coastal ecosystems are so important is that the carbon that stays in the ground can last for centuries.
That's why it is key for Belize to continue protecting mangroves. Do you agree? According to the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, each signatory country is expected to submit an updated National Climate Action Plan known as Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. Within their NDCs, countries communicate the actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries can consider protecting and restoring mangrove and seagrass ecosystems in their NDCs as a nature-based solutions to climate change. Belize has committed to protecting and restoring its mangrove and seagrass ecosystems within its NDC because of their benefits for carbon storage and coastal protection. A new research project in Belize seeks to contribute to this. Researchers have conducted fieldwork, including soil sample collection and measurements of mangrove trees to determine the amount of organic carbon found in soils and plants. The resulting data will provide a more precise and quantitative valuation of the carbon storage benefits of mangroves and, to a lesser extent, seagrass to aid in the implementation of Belize's NDC.
Belize is home to spectacular biodiversity on land and at sea. Our barrier reef is home to almost 1,400 species, some endangered. The reef works together with mangrove forests and seagrass beds to provide benefits for nature and people. However, these benefits are coming under threat. The combined effects of climate change and human activity are impacting these habitats, causing accelerated degradation of critical coastal ecosystems, and is jeopardizing their biodiversity. The degradation of these habitats not only endangers the species who call it home, but threatens the security of hundreds of thousands of Belizeans. Before we lose these habitats for good, we need to learn more about their importance to our own lives.
Mangroves and seagrasses, two of Belize's natural ecosystems, can be found in many places along Belize's coast. Globally, coastal zones with these ecosystems are considered some of the most productive places. They are important habitats, feeding grounds, and nurseries for numerous species. Turtles, manatees, birds, crabs, and various species of fish, from sharks to groupers, use these areas to feed, shelter, and reproduce. These ecosystems also provide nations with physical protection from storms and floods. In Belize, mangroves and seagrass are critical habitats and key to the local economy. It is estimated that mangroves alone contribute over $14 million in fisheries value, $176 million in tourism recreation, and $167 million in coastal protection per year. The benefit of these ecosystems extends well beyond their value for biodiversity. Coastal ecosystems can help communities mitigate against and adapt to climate change. Mangroves and seagrasses are natural carbon sinks, meaning they take in carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that is rapidly increasing due to human activities, and lock this carbon away, incorporating it in their tissues, roots, and soil.
Mangroves such as these take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We extract it, it goes into biomass, and then some of it goes into soils where it can be stored for thousands of years.
By removing carbon from the atmosphere and providing climate adaptation benefits, these ecosystems can play a role in global efforts to lessen the impacts of climate change.
They buffer shorelines, they help stabilize sediments, and so as a result, they...
Good morning, everyone. At this time, I'd like to ask you to kindly take your seats as we get ready to move into our final presentation and discussion session for this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to our questions and discussions this morning because there's a lot of discussion taking place right now. So a lot of exchange of ideas. So at this time, I'd just like to ask our participants who are still standing to the back to kindly make your ways to your seats so we can get started with our presentation for this morning. Thank you. Following the presentation this morning, we will be moving into a discussion and question and answer section. I'll be asking our presenters from the key presentations this morning to just join the head table so that we can move forward with that section to round out this morning. And then following that session, we'll be looking at a brief wrap-up and the next steps following this workshop. Once again, I'd like to ask those participants still standing in the back to kindly take your seats so that we can get started this morning. Good morning, everyone. We're ready to begin this morning. So the final presentation we have for today is a recap of past coastal marine land use and tenureship findings for Belize. And this morning we have Caroline Trench-Sandiford, President of the Belize Association of Planners, who will be delivering this presentation for us. Ms. Caroline, the time is yours.
This is forward. Okay, good morning. And my presentation is on the land use and land tenure research that was conducted by the Belize Association of Planners in 2016-2017. The content, we'll be looking a bit at the background, what was the big picture capture analyses, looking at a sample analysis from the 1 to 3 km from the coast, looking at the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System, which is the key component of the coast, as a case study for evidence-based decision-making. What were some of the land use conflicts and some policy and practice considerations? A little bit of background. Belize Association of Planners, we were incorporated in 2013. I think we have 2 of our founding members here. Let me recognize them. We have Keisha, who was a presenter before, and I see Gina. Where is Gina? I know I saw Gina somewhere. Gina Young? Yes, she was a member. I know I saw her earlier. So we're a membership organization of professional planners. Part of our mandate is assuring social justice and promoting sustainability in the natural and built environment. We have 5 programs for which we've done projects. Coastal resilience and climate change, for which this project was a part. Urban resilience and climate change. We have an urban lab that we're working on. Urban and rural land rights and gender justice. And we've worked over the past 10 years Next month, April 4th, we'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary. Thank you. And we've been working with state, non-state organizations, both academia, civil society, private sector, as well as development agencies. So what's the background to the work that we did? The work that we did was in partnership with the WWF, and I think, Nadia, I have to do a quickly apology. Somehow I missed your logo, but I must recognize the WWF. So the background to the work that we did, some of the issues that were contemporary, historical, and emerging at the time, unplanned urbanization and the development pressures, a trajectory that was emerging of unsustainable development pathways, 40% of our population living in coastal communities. At that time, there was also a significant increase in tourism, 38% overnight, 46% in the cruise tourism between 2006 and 2016. There was the issue of resource depletion, and at that time as well, climate change was becoming an existential threat. So, Coastal Zone Management Plan speaks to the anthropogenic threats stemming from various developmental activities that were associated with tourism and recreation, population growth, expansion, utility supply, dredging and mineral extraction, land clearance, pollution, waste disposal, fisheries, and aquaculture. So the whole purpose then of this land use and land tenure was to do a kind of stock taking, looking at how land was being used, what are the changes that were taking place, are there any rules that govern these changes, and what were the impacts of these land use changes. What was our methodology? Now, I'm not a technologically advanced person. I am aging, if I may say so. And so if there's any question that needs to be asked on that matter, I will just throw it at Keisha, because she was the person who was doing most of this GIS work that we were doing. But in terms of our methodology, what we did was develop a parcel and development site data inventory with some attributes. Within the coastal zone, we defined it at 1 to 3 kilometers on the coast and the keys. What were the tools and resources that we used to capture our data? There were some base map layers that we retrieved from either the Ministry of Natural Resources or Coastal Zone Management Institute, Open Data Kit that was linked to an online Google server, land tenure data from the Ministry of Natural Resources, from protected area managers, and so on. Ground truthing that went into it once we had cleared the desktop work. And there was some development guidelines report out of the coastal zone from 2003 that we were able to do some comparative analyses. And then there were several technical reports that we also looked at. So the big picture then in what we did. For our work, we work specifically with particular coastal planning regions, as you all are aware. The coastal zone is divided into planning regions, so we work specifically in the central, lighthouse, northern, south central, south northern, southern region, and the Turneffe Atoll. And if you look on the left, you're going to see an existing land use map that speaks to both the coast and the keys. And within that space, we worked on assessing data, both for the coast, as I've said, and on the keys. And in terms of our land use, we divided it into certain categories of land use, as well as identifying where the settlements were, where some subdivisions were, recreation, tourism, vacation home, and other general types of land use like agriculture, aquaculture, whether it was vacant, industrial, institutional, and so on and so forth. So this was done for the entire coastal zone, and then it was disaggregated down into planning regions. Big picture again in terms of the land tenure, where we were able to identify freehold, leasehold, national, other, unknown. And within that space, we also was identifying where our World Heritage Sites were. Again, this was decomposed into planning regions. So for each region, we were able to do a land use analysis as well as a land tenure analysis. This is just a capturing of the northern region and a sample of what a coastal analysis looked like. We looked at land size distribution. If you go back, let me see, yeah. If you go back, you'll see the northern region is all the way up by Corozal. To the right of it is Ambergris Caye, so it's that area today. This was supposed to be a little pointer or something. Okay, so that's that where it says Corozal, it's that area right to the right. And so in terms of the land use, land analysis that we did there, we identify approximately 9,421 parcels that covered something like 81,000 acres. Corozal, within this area, it was a declared area, so we were able to capture the land tenure information and distribution. And with the other resources that we had, we're also able to capture use. So in terms of land size distribution, we will note that most of the land in that area was less than an acre. And then, of course, there was, which was 86%. Then 6.7% was within 10 acres. There was 3.9% within 11 to 25 acres and 1.7% over 25 acres. And within these areas, there were huge tracts of land with thousands of acres of land. If we look at the land tenure, 87% was freehold, 12% was national, and there was 1% which was unknown. One of the distinctions between the northern region and the southern region was that when one looks at the data that came out of the southern region, we had more national lands than free title lands, but that has a lot to do with things like protected areas and less development taking place in the south. Also, it was linked to whether the area was declared or not, because once it's declared, then you'll find that the freehold, there's more freehold land within areas that have been declared. In terms of the land tenure type, we also were looking at, is this business, is this individual, is this, who are the people who were purchasing or who were having land. One of the things that came up earlier, I think it was Dr. K was talking about the whole issue of Belizeans. I will tell you that's a very complex area if you want to go dive in it. Because who is a Belizean? How does one know if you're a Belizean? Not color of a skin does not necessarily determine whether you're a Belizean or not, or an ethnicity. But it is an issue, yes, but many people have nationality and so on and so forth, and so it's a big issue. In terms of whether it's individual business, we note that 60% was owned by individual, 17% was owned by businesses, and these are registered companies, so once you're a company, you can go to the land registry and you will know more or less who are the shareholders within that particular company. Then there was national lands, and there was some, of course, that we said was unknown. In terms of land distribution, most of it was still wetlands, and then thereafter areas which were natural vegetation, and we decided to do a distinction between the two, simply because of the issue of the wetlands, the lagoons and mangroves and so on and so forth. And then there is the issue of what we call the settlements and partial settlements, and why we decided to do a distinction between them is simply because there's a trend that we were seeing within the northern areas in particular, where there were huge subdivisions for residential tourism. And these are developments that are going to have severe impact on the environment. In this particular case, you're seeing subdivisions already approved within areas of within the coastal, within the 1 to 3 kilometers, in some cases, maybe and going beyond, have not been developed yet, but they're being sold. And so if you think of the thousands of lots that are creating a network from all the way from Coruscant, and we see this going all the way down to Stan Creek, you're talking about thousands of lots, and you just imagine the amount of people, and then you start thinking about garbage and waste and so on and so forth. So we felt this was something that needs to be looked at, and why it becomes important is because oftentimes these things would pass through the land subdivision, the land utilization authority, and in some cases are required to do EIA, but they are looked at as projects. They are not really aggregated. So you're not seeing an aggregated impact of these developments. You're simply looking at them as one project at a time. So that provides us with what I call a sample of what coastal analysis was looking at. If we now look at what the key side, because remember we said that the coastal zone looks at the coastal as in terms of the land, terrestrial lands, and then it looks at the keys. We're going to use the barrier reef system, reserve system, as a sort of case study to give a sense of what some of the information findings that we had. And this came up particularly because at the time, our understanding, and Nadia can best explain all that, it's UNESCO, right? Am I correct? Was about to delist the Belize Barrier Reef System as a World Heritage Site. Am I correct? Yes, on the endangered list. And so we were asked to look at the data that we had to assist the WWF and the UNESCO Commission, is that how you pronounce it? Yes. To use the data that we had. So I'm using this as an example to show how the data was used for evidence-based decision-making, and how it got us back on the list, or we were hanging by a thread, and then they pulled back the thread. Am I correct? Yes. I think government had made a commitment to not lease or any more national lands or something to that effect. Yes, good. So when we look at the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System, our work looked at the Southwater Key, Sapodilla Key, Glover's Reach, Laughing Bird, all of which were in the Southern Planning Region, and Half Moon Key, which was in the Lighthouse Region. And then we also looked at Bacalar Chico, which was not a part of our terms of reference when we did our work. But basically what that showed you then is that the total lands for the Barrier Reef Reserve was 13,253 acres. What was in private was 2019. What was available at that time, 11,234. And if we really look at it, Bacalar Chico really took the cake because of that. That was the largest amount of acres in terms of the system, and the largest amount of publicly available lands. Oh yeah, why do I do this? I think correct, yes. Tell you I don't know about these things anymore. Okay, so let us. It's not. All right, good. So if we then look at, right, so let me, okay. Good, yes. So I had highlighted Southwater Key Marine Reserve because that is one of the areas that we're just going to drill down in to get a sense of what the information was like coming out of that. But if we look at the whole barrier reef system as a whole, in 2017, our focus was on 71 or 32% of the 224 development sites that we found in all the research that we did in all the planning regions, the Keys portion. And so within that, we found that the tourism, commercial tourism hotel had 34%. which was then followed by the residential fisherman camp. And thereafter, we can look at educational research and then residential vacation, partial settlement, and so on and so forth. Again, the 224 is, as a reminder, is really for the entire planning, the keys only, because the coast had its own analysis. And so, yes. So we had, like I said, that was what the land use was looking at in terms of a development site. And then if we looked at, okay. All right, so that was the land tenure, this was the land use. And if we drill down into Saltwater Key Marine Reserve, what we noted was of the 71 sites within the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System, 46 sites, or 64.8%, was actually in the Saltwater Key Marine Reserve, which suggested that that was the reserve that was really under pressure, development pressure. So you see on the left, we do have the existing land use. And again, I have to go a little closer. 37% of all the land use in the Saltwater Key Marine Reserve was for commercial, and 35% was for residential fishermen camp. So those were the two strong uses that was coming out of the Saltwater Key Marine Reserve. If we wanted to look at changes in land use over development site, we did a comparative analysis of a study that was done in 2003 and what was happening then and what was happening in 2017. And what we found was that for education and the outpost was the same. There was a reduction in the fishing camps at the time. There was an increase in the residential vacation home, but there was a dramatic increase when it came to commercial, the hotels and the resorts. And then there was not much change in terms of partial settlements within that key area. You won't be able to see this, but it's just a capture. We were able to capture this information simply because we went through all the keys, and each key, we were able to document what was happening in each key, and there were some keys that what you'll call a range of keys. So there, you may call a Cocoplum range, but Cocoplum range has numerous parts to it and so on and so forth. This kind of gives you a sense of the kind of work that we did. So we were able to say what was public lands, what was public lands, what was private lands, and what was really available in terms of national lands. In terms of land tenure by interest, one of the things we noted in the Saltwater Key Marine Reserve, we see that 69% of the land was freehold. And then 4% was leasehold and 17% was national. Now, within that change in land tenure interest between 2003 and 2017, what we saw was that the freehold, which include the leasehold and the freehold, the leasehold, and the unknown, was 71% in 2003. And public lands were 39%. By 2017, public lands had gone down to 17%, and freehold, leasehold, and unknown went up to 83%. So it gives us a sense of what was happening within the area in terms of the land tenure changes. One of the things we also looked at is that, there are some lovely development guidelines that the Coastal Zone Management Institute have. I think we have people from Coastal Zone here, right? Am I correct? Yes, lovely guidelines sitting on a shelf somewhere. But we said these guidelines let us look at the guidelines, and because they're great documents. In reality, they're great documents. It's just that we have not seen much value in terms of using them. But if we look at what the guidelines were saying, we looked at about 38 of the keys within that region, and we wanted to see whether they were complying without any development process really taking place, approval process, whether they were complying with what the guidelines were saying. And what we found was 29% were non-compliant, 16% were compliant, and for 55% we were unable to capture simply because access to some of the areas that we were in were a bit difficult. So what were some of the conflicts that came out of the research? Issues of dredging, both on the seabed and the lagoon, issues of seawalls and groins, and all of these in terms of conflict with environmental health and integrity. The issue of high impact development, so if you look at some of the development down south, Placencia and so on and so forth, you're going to see the luxury condos and so on and so forth. There was a conflict between human habitat and the native wildlife, between the fisher folks and the regulatory agencies, because the fisher folks complain that they're been limited in terms of what they can do. And then it came up earlier this morning, the 66 feet, where is it? In some places it doesn't exist. And people are demanding, and people are closing off. In some areas you would go, you can't walk on the beach because fences are up, and this kind of thing. So that was a big issue. Other issues had to do with between the fishing industry, the lobster trappers, and cruise tourism. That was a big issue. The fisher feel that the cruise tourism is affecting or impacting on their livelihoods. There are those who believe that they have a right to the benefits and free use of the natural environment, and no one should really limit them in any way, shape, or form. Then there are socioeconomic issues that came up as we were doing our work. The fact that the treatment of the low-skilled workers, who are mostly from low-income families, that they are, the way they were treated and exploited within the industries taking place within the coastal area. Then there was the intensification of use, meaning that you may find a couple of years ago, you may find a little residence, and now it becomes a bigger residence and now used as an Airbnb or a hotel, and we have seen where that has been increased. And then, as I said, the perception that the public recreation and leisure space on the coast and keys are for Belizeans, and they are being restricted from their right to use those resources. What were some barriers, gaps? We've discussed this earlier. I think Keisha painfully explained it. It came up. It continues to come up. The whole issue of a land use policy, you hear it was adopted, it's on a shelf, it's revised, it's something. There's always something happening with that national land use policy instead of it being used. There are issues with the issue with the EIA and the Building Act. Those are being currently used as de facto planning tools. In reality, there are major deficiencies in using those particular tools to regulate development. Simply because if you're looking at a building, it's simply looking at the structural integrity of the building. It's not really saying where it is to be built and how it is to be built, and taking into consideration issues of vulnerability and so on and so forth. In terms of the EIA, we brought that up earlier. That's really a reactive process to development, where you're looking at it as a project rather than having some guideline as to the type of development that ought to take place. Then, of course, there's multiple pieces of legislation: the Coastal Zone Act, the Housing and Town Planning Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Forest Act, the Land Use, and I can go on and on and on, and everybody, I don't know what they're doing. But lots of centralized decision-making, things happening in Belmopan, and with no knowledge or understanding of what is actually taking place in the local context or in the field. Compulsory registration, that was absent in most of the region. In the absence of compulsory registration, then land tenure issues and conflict emerge. The real estate market, we've heard about that. Data hoarding, low appetite for sharing, and government bureaucracy at key data source ministries. The Ministry of Natural Resources being one, and I won't hold that against you, Keisha. You just gone there. Hope you'll be able to make some changes there. I wish you all the luck. But Neja can tell you that it took us, 8 months? And we still never get it. And we did get some information. We don't want to tell you how we get it. But at the end of the day, we ended up with a lot of stuff from the coastal zone, which we have to thank them for. They were willing to share. And the layers that one has to go through. And of course, the real-time monitoring of changes in development trends and pattern. For example, when we were out there, we discovered things like new keys, which are not on any map. And what that did is that what we were seeing in the northern region, particularly, we saw people would take a little piece of mangrove that caught root somewhere, and then they make an application to permission to survey, and that little piece of mangrove, which may be 10 feet in diameter, becomes 4 or 5 acres of land in the sea that they dredge and fill. And so they were creating new keys. And then in the south, a lot had to do with the coral rubble that was being washed. And so you found little keys where fishermen were putting up their camps and saying, I now own this, but they are not on any file or anything for the Ministry of Natural Resources. So what are some policy considerations for policy and practice? Well, there's a decision that one has to make in terms of whether it's going to be business as usual, which will only continue to increase the conflicts, whether one is going to restrict development in these sensitive areas. There are some issues of property rights, whether there's going to be a move towards a more managed growth, whether what will be the role of governance and resilient planning. I hear of the blue economy, I hear of marine spatial planning. I don't know what's going on with those, but you can't talk about these things without talking about land use and regulating land use, because that's the root of all the development pressures that we face. What will be the role of local government and even protected area managers who are really in the field at the local level? How can they become more involved? And how can we build on some of the best practices of the actors, whether state or non-state, in the coastal realm? So those are some of the issues that came up under the land use and land tenure research that we did. Like I said, if there's any questions, and the Belize Association of Planners is social, I'm supposed to say that, I get these instructions. So we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the little things that the young people do now. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Ms. Caroline, for that presentation. There was so much to take in and digest and consider. So this is the time that we do have for questions. Any questions regarding this particular presentation? I have someone in the back.
Good morning, Nicole Awil Gomez from Wildlife Conservation Society. Lovely presentation, thank you, Ms. Carolyn. I guess this question may be a little bit for Nadia, who's chatting on the side. But so this data you're showing here is up to 2017, correct? So 7 years later, is there any plan to update it, and where do we stand today? So is this something that, and I understand, and you mentioned in the end of your presentation how difficult it is to gather the information itself from the source. What's the intention to, if it's through the association itself, updating these things regularly, or is it through a process of contracts, and what's the, so this, would you say this is a little old, or what's the plan for updating? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and I'll pass the mic on to Nadia on that one. However, development is dynamic, really. It's not static. And so when the pressure, when there's no more land in the north, as we have seen, Sampejo, Kikok, all these areas are becoming saturated, then it starts to move down south. And as we have seen where we saw the Saltwater Key Marine Reserve, we then have to start thinking of what needs to be done in terms of what the trends are showing us. From the Belize Association of Planners standpoint, we are a non-profit organization made up of membership, as I said. We are very poor. Planners tend to be poor. We don't make money. Nobody wants to listen to the planners, you know. And so we are relying very much so on support and grants from organizations like WWF and others who align, with whom our work aligned. Recently, we've been having a conversation with Nadia on how we can continue that process and to do another study, which we will then have 2003, 2017, and possibly 2023, and to really start looking at trends, a better grasp of what is happening. But just from the looks of it, we know that the challenge and the pressures are now moving from the north and start moving along the coast and in the Keys in the south.
Yeah, rightly so, and that begs the need for this coastal marine land tenure analysis that we shared information from now. The idea is for us to try to get at some of that understanding of threats and how we can engage, you know, and helping, you know, the coastal zone and the lands department in be able to get the information they need to inform their management.
Thanks, Nadia. And I guess I can just briefly add, most of you here were able to see the presentation delivered by Mr. Samir Rosado, who is the process lead for Belize's marine spatial planning process. And so the CZMAI is leading that to develop the Belize Sustainable Ocean Plan. The information to be delivered under the land tenure assessment will help to inform the development of that plan. And so we're very much looking forward to working through that collaborative effort to have that information be available, because we know this is an opportune time to do some backstopping through the MSP process. And there is the commitment at the very highest level in terms of the MSP being a central component of the Belize Blue Bond Agreement.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else from the floor with a question or comment for our panel from this morning?
I'm just curious, was the Lands Department invited to this symposium?
Yes, I am representing the Lands Department.
And we had members from the Lands Department with us yesterday as well. Am I right?
Hi, so Steve Canty with the Smithsonian. I was just wondering, with the Lands Department or land planning, how does the 12,000 hectares of protection and the 4,000 hectares of restoration fit into this planning and then the future monitoring of this?
I do believe that our engagement with the WWF and the coastal zone will further inform how we, well, definitely our land use policy, the updating of the national land use policy. I know that we're embarking on that process soon, right, Miss Michelle? You can give us a little light on some of the. Yes, okay. Yes, we're. Miss Michelle is the director of the mining unit, and she had secured some funding for the land use policy under the soil care project. I a regional soil care project, right? So that process will be starting soon. So within the land use policy and the updating of that, the process of updating that policy, we definitely will take into account the recommendations for, the targets for the NDCs, and hopefully the policy can guide us in how we will work towards that goal.
Thank you. No?
So just to follow up, because that's really promising, but with that, what management, if any, will come to those restored areas? Is there, like, as that land use comes in, those areas are restored? Will they remain as general public lands? Will they move into protected areas? Will they move into sustainable use zones, multiple use zones, or is that part of that planning as of yet?
So we still need to think about that, how we'll manage that, Steve. But the idea, if we're going to be identifying areas for mangrove protection and mangrove restoration, we want to make sure it's effectively integrated within the land use policy, the integrated coastal zone management plan, and the MSP process as well. I don't know, Michelle, can I call you out to just say something about the land use policy?
Hi, good morning. Michelle Alvarez in the Ministry of Natural Resources, Petroleum and Mining. Yes, my substantive role is as Inspector of Mines in Mining Unit, but my other responsibility is really the focal point for the convention, the UN Convention to combat desertification and climate change, land degradation, really. This goes way back. I think in 2011, indeed, there was a revision of the National Land Use Policy. It was accepted by Cabinet, but little implementation was done. And with the World Bank's assistance in 2017, 2018, thereabouts, through the BCRIP project, the Belize Climate Resilience Infrastructure Project, the Ministry of Natural Resources received funding to update the 2011 version of the land use policy, along with the development of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. So we have those tools in the ministry, but they were accepted. But again, we have a critical weakness in implementation. All of those projects had gone through substantial public consultation in the country, but little goes on after the project has been completed. And we have identified that, and part of our weakness is truly the political will to move the next steps and to strengthen the institutional capacity of the ministry to work towards implementation and monitoring. So now, part of what we have been doing in the region through a CARICOM initiative is a regional project for Caribbean small island development states, a GEF-funded project referred to as Soil Care Phase 1, because there are plans for a Phase 2. In Soil Care, one of the major components across the participating Caribbean member states is to update our national soils information and the soils map, which are really outdated from maybe the 50s, the 60s, thereabouts. There have been private companies who do additional research in parts of member countries, but we need to do an expansion and an improvement of the soil information. There are other components. It's a UNCCD project. The intention is to implement some of our commitments to that convention. You put me on the spot, so my story is going to be very long, right? So just bear with me. In 2019, 2020, just before COVID and the shutdown, we had just completed via technical assistance and financial assistance from the UNCCD, setting our national land degradation neutrality targets. Those are voluntary targets, and close to 200 country parties worldwide have set voluntary targets. And so the Soil Care Project seeks to implement some of those targets, including some of the landscape restoration targets and measures that the Forest Department has identified. So we're not working alone as a ministry. This is a national initiative. So for our country, we have requested through the soil care financing from Jeff to identify additional funds to go back to that 2019 land use policy, to go back to our stakeholders and make it more realistic. It was, the intention in 2017 was to make it climate resilient, develop a climate resilient policy. But we want to go beyond that now with this updating version to include gender responsiveness and make it make us include our LDN targets so that we address drought and land degradation issues. So this year, the budget has been identified. So our next steps is to develop the terms of reference for the procurement of a national consultant who will help this process. So you all will definitely be hearing from us as soon as we get the consultant hired. We're not reinventing the wheel. We have a good solid land use policy, but we just need to move further. We need impetus, we need fire under our behinds and you all can attest to that. Every single workshop we go, we hear, yes, we need to get this done. It's one of the NDC targets to get it done, because without it, we're living in chaos, really. Okay, so I hope I addressed some of your questions. A lot of the targets that were identified for landscape restoration are included in the NDCs already. They were identified when we did the LDN target setting process. So we're not without a clue here. We know full well where we want to go. We just need the buy-in of our political leaders.
Thank you very much for the information, the context being gained from the information, and looking at really placing us in this position where we need to take this information and then take action, collective action, talking about the need for networking, stronger collaboration. We still have time if there's anybody else with a pressing question or observation from our session this morning, or anything from yesterday's session that you may feel was something that you would like to have mentioned within this national forum at this time.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a little bit to the conversation as it relates to
a national land use policy, because I don't want it to be seen as the panacea of all, of all, because in reality it is not. But it is a foundation from which development can be managed. And I think in moving forward, that is the process that one has to take on, how you manage development. You can't stop it, but you must manage it if we're to talk about a more resilient future. I wanted to comment on the policy itself. Policy is intent. That's all it is. It's intent. It sets out the intent of government, so if the government adopts it, it really just sets out their intent. The framework is what is going to be important, because it's the framework that is going to be needed in terms of how you manage the development process. If I recall the 2011 policy and the revised policy, I think it was 2016, Michelle, if I'm not mistaken, 2016. 2017 provides for the same archaic, centralized, duplication kind of system. In other words, it's relying right back on what is not working. And that is something that has to be addressed. To give you a quick capture, and this is just my recollection, development in Belize have multiple pieces of legislation. There's a Housing and Town Planning Act, which speaks to development and how we regulate it, which calls for the passing of resolutions to prepare planning schemes, and the minister has a discretionary power to do that. That's not functioning at all. Then there is the Coastal Zone Management Act, which mandates, it's not discretionary, a coastal zone management plan has to be produced, am I correct? But they have no power to enforce anything nor to implement anything. They are reliant on those very other people, the Housing and Town Planning, the Ministry of Natural Resources, and so on. Then you have the Environmental Protection Act, which, as I've mentioned before, is a de facto kind of tool that reacts to an application rather than guide development as it ought to be. Then there's the Building Act, which speaks of a central building authority that approves building construction, which is only one component of development. And then it does say within the Act that an application can be prohibited if it does not comply with a land use and zoning plan for which there is none that exists. And then you have the Land Utilization Act, which provides for subdivision of land and which provides for special coordinated development area. Am I correct? But it provides no framework as to how that is supposed to be implemented and enforced. I say all that as to say, policy is lovely, but if you don't have the framework that captures the basic issues that is hindering managing development, then we will continue to talk about a policy, revising it, updating it, but development will continue unregulated and unmanaged. We speak now of a marine spatial plan. I was not here for that conversation, so I'm not too clear as to where that is going. If that looks at just the water or the land as well, as which the coastal zone is the ambit of the coastal zone. But if one does not look at the root cause of why we are having development as it is ongoing today, then we're going to be right back at square one, spending millions of dollars, updating plans, producing plans, and nothing is going to happen. I just throw this out for consideration. And so when Dr. K says, what is it that we need to do? Dr. K, I'm just throwing out a couple of things you have to take into consideration in terms of advocacy. because it's not just about the policy. It's really about the framework. And we can have policies that look at what types of development, what types of uses, but if you don't have the legislation which empowers an entity to review those applications and to approve them according to some plan that exists, then we're really wasting our time with that. So just my comments on that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carolyn. I think those are solid comments to bring this session to a close. And with the closing of this session, we'll be closing the two-day workshop that has been taking place over the last 2 days on blue carbon knowledge sharing. And, you know, just rounding out the wonderful discussions that we have had today, definitely looking at, I have someone who has a comment right in front. Welcome.
So before we close, I just wanted to say heartfelt thank you to Nadia and her team for organizing these past 2 days. It's been very informative and engaging, and if we could have a round of applause for WWF.
Thank you, Stacey. I also want to call out to, he's not here, but Colin Martis from the National Climate Change Center. He was my supporting arm along the way as well, too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, to bring something like this to fruition, it takes an entire team. So as we get ready to close off today, Ms. Nadia, I'd like to ask you to just guide us through what would be the next steps following the workshop. What can participants look forward to? How will this engagement continue? What are the expectations?
Yeah, so this is the first step. This workshop was centered around sharing some of the knowledge we have right now, but the work hasn't stopped, of course. No? We still have to meet those NDC targets that we had worked with the government collaboratively to set within the NDC. We'll be working collaboratively. This is not, when I say we, it's not WWF. I'm talking about the Forest Department, I'm talking about Coastal Zone, I'm talking about the Lands Department, I'm talking about the National Climate Change Center, and you guys, the varied government departments, the conservation group. We need all the power behind us if we are to truly meet these NDC targets as a country. So you'll be hearing from us on the various work we have planned ahead. Coastal Zone, you know, is pushing forward with their MSP process, the Resilience Project, which we are happy to be a part of. Lands Department will be helping with working with the land tenure analysis. So there's a lot going on, and we are so excited to be able to continue this work going forward. Look out to hear from us. We'll also be sharing, I think we have permission from all the presenters to share their presentation, right? We'll turn those into some PDF and then share it. We also have full recording of the workshops, which we'll be sharing those as well. And we'll be available to respond to any questions that comes in, no? So thanks once again for taking the time to be with us over the past 2 days. We truly appreciate it. We know that you guys have a busy schedule and you made the time and showed up. So that's really, you know, comforting to see, and it shows that people are passionate about coastal ecosystems. So let's give everyone a round of applause. So in this afternoon session, I'll turn over to you right now, Michelle. We are closing the workshop. The key agenda of the workshop will be done now, and then this afternoon it's going to be a working session with the Forest Department. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And just to say thank you to each and every one of you for your attention, your participation over the 2-day period. Of course, this workshop was brought to us by the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, the National Climate Change Office, Forest Department, Ministry of Blue Economy, and Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute in collaboration with the World Wildlife Fund, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Smithsonian Institute, and Sylvestrum Climate Associates. I want to thank you for your time. You can now join us for lunch in the Queen's Room, where we had lunch yesterday. Thank you very much. For those of you traveling, safe travels. For those of you for the session this afternoon, we wish you a fruitful session. Thank you.
and in collaboration with local NGO partners and national government, including the Belize National Climate Change Office, the Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute, and the Fisheries and Forest Departments. This project will provide a comprehensive assessment of carbon stored within mangrove forests across Belize and develop a baseline carbon stock estimate for seagrass.
This field work that we just did is just helping to provide us with some additional justification for why we need to protect these ecosystems. Because the aim now is for us to understand the quantity of carbon that these ecosystems are sequestering nationally. And so that this information can then be integrated within Belize's REDD+ inventory.
Researchers have